All right, it looks like it has slowed down a little bit, so I'll get started just with the opening and then we'll let people in as they join. But first, hello and welcome everybody. I'm Julie Miller. I'm with the Haverford College Center for Peace and Global Citizenship, based in Haverford, Pennsylvania, outside of Philadelphia. Thanks for joining this webinar on a toolkit for understanding local issues in global context, including racism and structural inequality, hosted by Dr. Nicole Stokes and Dr. Hartman. In a couple minutes, I'm going to do a tech overview, but for now, we're still getting some people to join, so we'll give that maybe 30 more seconds. Okay, we can get started now. So yeah, thank you for joining us. It's great to see so many people in the Zoom room. My name is Julie Miller. I'm the person that you will want to chat with if you have any technical issues during this webinar. You can use the chat, which if you have your screen open, you'll see the little chat icon in the middle. When you open that, you'll be able to either message everybody in the group, or you can send a direct message to me and possibly Eric Hartman and Nicole Stokes. So if you have any issues, you'll want to direct message me through that chat function. Today's webinar is co-sponsored by 3 membership networks. At the Center for Peace and Global Citizenship here at Haverford College, we're members of the first 2 and we host the 3rd. Those networks are the Pennsylvania Council for International Education, also known as PACE, the Philadelphia Higher Education Network for Neighborhood Development, known as FEND, and the community-based Global Learning Collaborative, known as the Collaborative for short. These 3 networks all have different missions, but their missions overlap at the intersection of supporting diverse people working together on campuses and in communities to create more welcoming, just, inclusive, and sustainable communities. Today's webinar will focus specifically on expanding local understanding of global injustices and ways to foster classroom discussions and dialogues about inequality and racial discrimination. So for the technology you're using today, as you're joining, everybody is set on mute. We have about 100 registrants, and we currently have a little bit close to half of those people in the room right now. So everyone's muted so we don't get any feedback. We do encourage you to use the chat function to the whole group to foster discussion throughout the presentation. And again, if you have any technical difficulties or questions, you can direct message me. My name's Julie Miller, and I can try to help you figure out how to troubleshoot. If there are any racist or discriminatory messages during the dialogue, we retain the right to remove participants if necessary. We do encourage questions and conversation in the spirit of advancing shared understanding. As you joined, you probably noticed that this webinar is being recorded. We just wanted to make sure that everybody is aware of that. So you can shut off your video if you want, or have it on. We love to see your faces, but whatever you're comfortable with. And at the very end of this webinar, before you leave, we will launch a very brief poll to get your feedback, because we are definitely interested in hearing your thoughts about how today went. So yes, as a final reminder, I'm Julie Miller. I'm the person you should message if you have any technical difficulties through the chat function, and I'll try to troubleshoot with you. So now I'm going to pass the mic over to Dr. Nora Reynolds, who is director of the Community-Based Global Learning Collaborative and a fellow at the Haverford College Center for Peace and Global Citizenship.
Thank you, Julie. As Julie mentioned, I'm Nora Reynolds, and I direct the Community-Based Global Learning Collaborative, which is a membership-based network hosted at Haverford College Center for Peace and Global Citizenship. And we support a range of learning activities and resources for community organization and educational institutions dedicated to advancing critical, ethical, and aspirationally decolonial community-based learning and research for more just, inclusive, sustainable communities. When the pandemic hit, we recognized that most of the activities that we had traditionally supported for civic and global learning would cease for the foreseeable future. We also saw the ways in which the crisis highlighted and continues to highlight the importance of thinking globally and structurally, and educating young people with civic learning that better understands and emphasizes interdependence. In that moment, working with over 20 different organizations and institutions, we developed an online global solidarity and local actions toolkit that you'll hear more about today. So that's just a small bit of background on me and the collaborative. Today, I'll be managing the chat and dropping messages and questions in. So we encourage you to use the chat throughout. We did have about, as Julie mentioned, about 100 total registrants, about half of whom were from the higher education sector. We also had registrants from K-12 education, the business sector, and the nonprofit sector. So just to get comfortable using the chat and to see who's in the room together, why don't we all drop in a very brief 3-word or 3-phrase introduction. So we could go with work, location, and what brings you to this conversation today. So just very, very brief. So I'll pop mine in here. I'd say something like, and I'm just going to give everyone a full minute or two to drop those in and read who is here in the room together today. So go ahead and start popping in your intros. Wonderful. Thank you all for introducing, and please continue to pop in those introductions as we go here. So I will turn it over to Dr. Eric Hartman, who is the Executive Director of the Center for Peace and Global Citizenship at Haverford College, also a board or steering committee member with both PACE and FEND, as well as co-founder of the Community-Based Global Learning Collaborative. So go ahead, Eric.
Thanks, Nora, and thanks everybody for joining us today. And I especially want to thank Nicole Stokes for being a co-presenter today, and Nora and Julie for bringing this together. And Stephanie Keene, who's on here as well, and is a real author of the page that we'll talk about in particular. She and I co-authored, as well as the articles that I'll be referring to. So I am going to talk through 5 themes here over the next 10 to 15 minutes. These themes I'll share in just a second. And then I want to attempt to illuminate with a story about the place that we're in that relates to my own civic experience in life and opportunities. And I'm doing that, I'm conscious, and especially when I see who of the 100 registrants is in the room today. You know, you're a very thoughtful crowd, and I might repeat something you've seen or done before, but I do think all of the action, well, not all of the action, I'm always so interested in what I call the yellow lights in community organizing. So there are green lights who are our friends, and red lights who aren't necessarily going to open their minds to thinking together. But people who are a little bit resistant, where is that and how do we connect with them? And so I hope we have some relevant tools to adapt toward that here. So the toolkit that we'll share a bit about today is designed to support a civics of interdependence. And two things I want to mention or emphasize there. Civics is for everyone. I know that I'm a civic education scholar, and so I'm aware as anyone that there are ways in which civics becomes a discipline on campuses sometimes. What we tried to do with the toolkit was make sure that we could do something that touched anyone who's really curious and interested in thinking about how our lives, justices, and injustices relate to one another. COVID or centuries of racial discrimination both illuminate across space and across time how we can't think in terms of jurisdictions. It's not a question of, are you a national citizen, are you a global citizen? How are we interdependent, and how do we live well with one another is really what this toolkit tries to grapple into. However far away those ideas might go, either historically or across space, the most tangible opportunities for understanding and action are usually local and interpersonal. And actually, after I present a little bit about structural, Nicole's going to pick up how these structures can manifest in classroom interactions, among other things. At the collaborative, we're deeply committed to participatory and public scholarship. And that's kind of modeled in this toolkit. It's participatory in the sense that when we saw this challenge back in April, colleagues from across the US and around the world, from nonprofits and from higher ed institutions and elsewhere, worked together on creating something. And it's still open to co-creation. We're very excited that more submissions come in and say, hey, we'd like to think through the lens from Cape Town or from Singapore or from Providence, Rhode Island. There's all sorts of possibilities. So it's participatory and it's public. I'm really glad to be at Haverford College Center for Peace and Global Citizenship, and part of what we wanted to be sure we did when we at the center started to work on this was make sure it didn't only stay on our small campus, but it's something that people elsewhere could use. And I still get, I think sometimes the ethos in higher ed is so funny. I still get emails saying, is it okay if we use this? It's on the internet for you to use. We put it out there on purpose. We want you to use it. Adapt it for your own courses, drop it into your own course management software, change it a little bit for your purposes, but please, there's lots of different kinds of labor here, and we hope it's to good purposes. So please. All people are equally dignified miracles. I say this a lot of different ways, but the commitment to human dignity is at the core of any decent conception of democracy, I would argue, and at the core of social justice work, and certainly ethical interdependence. I'll share a global citizenship definition from my own work in just a moment that relates to that, as well as what we're going to do here is get specific on the topics of racism and structural inequality and how they relate to that. So I noticed in the final moments of preparation that we say this is a local global, and sometimes if we don't make really explicit how we get into that, well, then we're making assumptions. So when I talk about global citizenship, I'm talking about a critical approach that involves a commitment to fundamental human dignity, couched in critically reflective understanding of historic and contemporary systems of oppression, along with acknowledgement of positionality within those systems. A critical global citizenship connect with values, reflection, and action. It's not enough to raise awareness, but how do we step forward? It calls us to humble, careful, and continuous effort to build a world, whether that's in our classrooms, on our campuses, in our communities, but to build a world that better acknowledges every individual's basic human dignity. Clearly, when we get into questions of structural racism in this space in the Philadelphia region, which is what we're going to focus on as an example today, it's relevant to any space, but we're going to focus on as an example today, we're getting into movement of people and structures across histories. We're in particular today going to be looking at the last 100 years, though it goes much farther than that. So the page that is relevant to what I'll share today is the page that's cited here. By the way, when this is done, we'll have a recording of the session, and we'll also send out the slides to everybody who registered, so you have these citations. But this is the page, and it starts like all of our pages with a question, about how long it's going to take and a personal reflection. And then we get into, in this case, a video that's about 7 to 10 minutes on redlining and how it affects equity over time. We're trying to do something that's exciting for students to look at when we realize they're stuck in books and Zoom an awful lot these days. When I say structural racism, we drew from the Aspen Institute definition for this, for the page that we developed: a system in which public policies, institutional practices, cultural representations, and other norms work in various, often reinforcing ways to perpetuate racial group inequity. It identifies dimensions of our history and culture that have allowed privileges associated with whiteness and disadvantages associated with color to endure and adapt over time. Structural racism is not something that a few people or institutions choose to practice. I think this is so important to understand and embrace. And as I mentioned earlier, where I think a lot of the action seems to be in community, political organizing, and education today is working with people who are having trouble with the sense of, well, I haven't done the claim, I should say, I haven't done anything racist. You know, how am I involved with this? So I wanted to think and be honest about my positionality, think in terms of my own family. So I bothered my older half sister to pull out some old photos of my father very recently. My dad was born in 1933 in Red Lion, Pennsylvania, which is a rural town in York, Pennsylvania. He was born in a house there. I can say with honesty, and I realize this is actually might be rare among rural white men, I never heard my dad say a racist thing. I certainly never heard him use a slur. And it just wasn't his orientation. He was born in 1933. His orientation was, in fact, in other directions. Although he wasn't an activist, he was very committed to the idea of equality. 1933, of course, is also when the Fair Housing Administration came out with redlining, which I just mentioned. One of the videos we start with, it's from Adam Ruins Everything, really breaks down redlining with great clarity and relevance. About 10, 15 years later, my dad's growing into a teenager. And in Philadelphia, you know, the story of American history that I heard in high school kind of looks at World War II as this moment of great unification, right? This moment where the values of the country are positioned against Nazi Germany as having opposite values. During that time, there were eight, I can't get over this story, 8 trolley workers who were Black, who were promoted by the Philadelphia Transit Company. And as a result, the union at the Philadelphia Transit Company went on strike. The strike in Philadelphia halted work production of 300,000 workers during America's war effort in one of America's largest sites of industrial production. So in other words, the union at the time put racism ahead of the war with Nazi Germany over 8 particular individuals' positions. President Roosevelt ended up sending 5,000 troops to Philadelphia to ensure that the workers had the chance to go back to work and the strike. So my dad graduated from a state institution called Millersville in Pennsylvania in 1954. He went into the Army to get the GI Bill. And because he was able to serve in Germany during the Korean War, lucky man that he was, he used the GI Bill to go to graduate school at Michigan State University. Of course, simultaneously with that, the GI Bill was systematically not allowed to be used by Black GIs who were returning. Again, my father, of course, did nothing other than benefit from discrimination against other people in terms of his own willingness here. Simultaneously in that year, a town outside the Philadelphia region became somewhat famous years later in a documentary called The Crisis in Levittown. And one thing I want to mention here is I'm going to tag back and forth here between the suburbs and the city, and I think that's really important, in part because sometimes our narratives in the United States of racism, you know, the racism's in rural parts, or it's in the South, or it's in the suburbs. It is throughout these spaces, throughout these years, and that's how structural racism manifests over time. So a Black family ended up living in Levittown for some years, but had to resist so much harassment and just various forms of violence and intimidation for so long during that time, resulting in the documentary. In the 1960s, in the city, Black students advocated for a Black history curriculum. That advocacy was broken up by what became a notorious police commissioner, then mayor, named Frank Rizzo, responded with violence to students asking for educational opportunities. In the same decade, outside of the city, a Black family moved to Folcroft in Delaware County, and 1,500 demonstrators showed up to resist integration there. During that time, my dad was moving into Michigan and Wisconsin with his family, with no one suggesting he shouldn't live there. A decade later, the Whitman Park project was resisted by neighborhood groups resisting integration in the city for a public housing project. And the United States court system eventually found against the government of Philadelphia for acting discriminatorily as part of this as well. A Black Vietnam War vet who lived in the area was quoted as saying he had rocks and beer bottles thrown through his windows. He later said, "I've lived all around the world. I've lived in the American South. I've never experienced anything as bad as this." Through the 80s, 90s, and into the O's, were, I think, rather familiar with what's variously called the New Jim Crow, school to prison pipeline, etc. In the United States, of course, we incarcerate people who are Black at many times the rate of people who are white. It's a higher disproportionate rate in Pennsylvania and higher still in Philadelphia. And Pennsylvania and Philadelphia both have higher rates of incarceration than the rest of the country as well. We also have a page that's specifically on decarceration in our region that Stephanie Keene, who's here, also played a major, that really led on that page. And that brings us around to our present time. Before I hand off to Nicole, I just wanted to emphasize a couple of things here. One, the page that I referenced, a single page of 75 minutes, it has a video and 2 short readings that kind of share all of this information and a little bit more quickly and collectively, and ask students reflective questions about their own lives. I wanted to share with you all in the new population. In some ways, I'm modeling what we say you can do. I just took that page and the resources from it and did something a little different today, tying it to my own history. And that's in part because, that's in part because as a citizen, I'm extremely concerned that I still see some people asking questions about structural racism and whether it's real, which to me means there's lots of silent people who are still thinking those types of questions. And there are other structural inequities that exist. The thing that I illuminate here with my story, or I'm trying to illuminate with my and my family's story, is whatever hard work my dad may or may not have done, whatever sorts of things he didn't have to deal with a set of challenges that are fundamentally about Blackness, and he therefore benefited from opportunities disproportionately. And that's something that I, as a citizen and educator, think I need to understand and think about what it means for my actions in the world, which we actually build into actions as we hear from Dr. Stokes in just a moment, and after, as we think forward in this presentation as well. So Nicole Stokes, St. Joseph University, and I kick us off.
Thank you. Thanks, Eric. This was great. True disclosure, or full disclosure, I should say, I am a structuralist in terms of being a sociologist who likes to answer big macro questions, but I also like to answer those questions in the day-to-day lived experience. I'm also a qualitative researcher. So I share that with you to say that my half of this presentation really takes the macro and tries to make it manageable in terms of how one can operationalize these concepts in their day-to-day living. So this section, I'm really going to tie some of the structural conditions and causes that Eric outlined with that historical analysis. I loved the framing because I too agree that sometimes we tend to think racism stops at Philadelphia, like there's a magic line in the sand, and that's some other part of the country's problem. Or we take the other positioning of, constantly focusing in on urban problems in quotations, and those things are not problems that manifest into the suburban areas in which many of us live or occupy or our institutions are. I would also say, again, full disclosure, I think we as academics tend to intellectualize this history and information to the point where we create distance. We tend to think about it in very we pontificate, tend to think about it in very haughty ways, but we don't always make it very granular and tactile and practical for our everyday use. So again, that's my goal with this section. If you would change the slide, please. Thank you. So I always like to start with language and some questions that hopefully are operating in the background for you. These are questions that I tend to think about when I work with institutions who call me in as a diversity consultant, or working with my own institution when I do diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings for different units. And I ask these questions intentionally. So think about your organization. I know we have a mixed audience of educators of different levels, as well as some who work in private industry. But think about your workplace or your organization, and think about which groups feel as if they're at home, right? They don't see a substantive, quote, problem, or the workplace is a pleasant environment for them. And then think about the people who may feel as if they come there every day or attend school there every day and feel as if they are unwanted guests, and the institution being the host that's not terribly welcoming. So think about that. Think about whose norms, values, and perspectives does the institution consider to be normal? And I put normal in quotations. We're going to get into that a little bit later. But whose positioning or attitudes and perspectives, values are considered legitimate? Who does the organization silence, marginalize, or delegitimize, right? Who inhabits positions of power within the institution? And again, I believe that reflection begins at home. So again, when we look at the leadership in our respective institutions, who occupies those positions? Whose experiences, norms, values, perspectives influence an institution's policies, laws, systems of evaluation? And again, I'll speak to my own world in higher education. When I pose that question, I talk about tenure, promotion. For the staff and administrative side, I talk about performance evaluations, right? And whose work is valued more than others, who sets the standard for what work is considered to be valuable for the academy, etc. And last, whose interests does the institution protect? And that can be a multi-layered question with multi-layered answers, but it's one worth thinking about. And oftentimes there's a relationship between policy and interest. So once an institution or organization starts looking very critically at its own policies, then you start to see interest and whose interests are represented in those policies. The two questions go together. So keep those in the back of your mind. I always like to start with, we've all had diversity and inclusion trainings. Some of you may have been in my trainings, but it doesn't mean that pedagogically all trainings are the same. So I like to agree on a set of operational definitions as we go forward, and I will move very quickly here. But when we talk about diversity, this is just your numbers. We have X percentage of this group, Y percentage of that group, those are your numbers. Now, some institutions may have diversity problems where if you look at the total number of the people who attend or the total number of people who work at that institution, there may not be representation of different populations in terms of the relationship of that population in society at large, right? So there are 15% of African Americans, according to census data nationwide. So if your organization has 2% African Americans, you may want to be asking some questions as to why, right? So that's a diversity question. Inclusion gets more into what do you do once you have XYZ categories of people. So I always say, again, using the analogy of the institution or organization as the host, any of you who've ever hosted a party and brought your circles of friends together, they may not like each other, but they like you, right? They came to your house because you're the host of the party. Well, everyone at the party may not be having the same experience. So that's an inclusion issue, to start to look at your organization critically to say, are all voices welcome? Do we truly welcome, do we say we welcome a diversity of thought, but then we don't promote those people who have diversity of thought? Do we silence particular points of view that we don't feel like listening to because, you know, the eye roll when someone speaks in the staff meeting, right? That's an inclusion problem. And equity and equality are two words that people use interchangeably, but not correct. Equality is where you treat everyone the same, right? So those of us who are educators, if you have rules and regulations on your course syllabus, you say my policies are for everyone, right? That's a policy of equality. Equity gives people what they need to be successful, and what they need to be successful might be different person to person. So again, I come back to somebody who has managed a team, right? I have a team of people who work for me and with me, and I manage each of those individuals very differently because they need something different from me as their manager. That's a policy of equity, right? So when I take organizations through kind of an organizational audit of their policies, practices, procedures, I look at where there are places for equality and I look at where there are places for equity, because those things are different. And so companies usually are trying to strive for more equity than equality, hopefully. And then microaggressions, where I want to spend the bulk of our time on in this next middle section. Most people know what this is if you have either delivered it or experienced it. I call this, it's almost like getting a paper cut, right? So a paper cut is an immediate ouch. Okay, you're not going to die or bleed to death from a paper cut, but if you got 100 of those a day, the cumulative effect of that would be extraordinarily painful, right? Imagine 100 paper cuts all over your body. Microaggressions function like that. So in and of itself as an isolated incident, not so bad, but the cumulative effect of day in, day out, and the amount over the day in and day out begins to add up on the spirit or the soul. If you'll change the slide, please. Thank you. Very quickly, bias. This is a term people use a lot, and most people remember the negative, but bias can also be an inclination in favor of something, what we also call affinities. So my work with Pacey, or if you were to look at my CV and look at where I volunteer my time, you probably will get to see some patterns, right? So for me, I support organizations that are about racial equity, gender equity, international and global citizenship. So there's a rhyme to my reason, so to speak. You would probably look at my CV and say, oh, Nicole has some clear affinities. Those are biases in favor of. Now, does that mean I have never mentored a man? Does that mean I have never mentored a white person? Does that mean I have never, treated domestic students in ways that are different from my international students? No. So you can have affinities, right, that it doesn't necessarily result in biased behavior as a result of it. But as we're going to talk about, being aware of what your biases are, the positives and the negatives, is a way, once you have awareness, you're able to regulate your behavior accordingly so that your biases don't become prejudices, don't become discrimination. So again, you can read the slide. I'm not going to read it to you, but kind of two quick examples. Most people know the explicit examples. Explicit is your conscious bias. Implicit bias is your unconscious. Unconscious are the things that are running around in the background like a computer program. You're not even aware it's there, but your behavior indicates that something is there. So I'll give an example. If someone were to say, when I do trainings with faculty, I kind of challenge them a bit on who they invite to collaborate with them. So for example, I was doing a training for STEM faculty, and women in STEM, there were not many women in their department. And when pressed, I said to the gentlemen in the STEM departments, how come you don't seek out your female colleagues for collaboration on that NSF grant that you got, or the NIH grant? And they said, well, so-and-so just had a baby, and I don't know, this is a 5-year research project. Okay, so just because one has a baby doesn't mean that they can't prioritize their time to participate on the research, but you're already excluding them because you assume because they have a baby, they don't have time for research. So I'm using that as an example to say, I don't think anybody would shout from the mountaintops, I am a sexist, that's why I don't include so-and-so. But that was an example of an implicit bias that was operating in the background that guided the decision-making to not include that female colleague on a very important grant. So I'm using that as an example. We can go to the next slide, please. So I spent time on microaggressions, and I wanted to show you a couple of them here. One, if I were, I could be holding the sign that the woman's holding right now because someone actually did walk up to me and say, oh, it's so great to see you here. You're such a product of affirmative action. Oh yes, I saw the faces. And this was a person at an academic institution I shall not name, but those are examples of microaggressions. That is a clear one, but the person saying it didn't feel it was, right? So it usually is well-intentioned people who would probably say to themselves, there's no way in the world I'm racist because I have XYZ things, we'll get to that later, on my list that make me not a racist, right? The other one on the other side is someone who has transitioned and is part of the LGBTQIA community, and someone's like, wow, I never would have guessed you were ever a girl before. And then obviously this is someone who now identifies as a man. So again, I'm using these examples because they're things that are said in everyday language, but they perpetuate, again, that worldview or that structural component of some form of privilege and or superiority. So we'll get to those in a second. If you'll go to the next slide, please. So here are some commonplace workplace microaggressions, and I like to highlight, these are ones I've heard a lot in the workplace over the years. You know, saying to someone who's an international colleague, your English is excellent. Wow, it's so clear, right? Those are things that one would say to, and again, several scholars have written on this. Someone who coined the term microaggression has spoken specifically about being an Asian scholar and having students and colleagues remark constantly how well his English, how well he speaks English, etc. And this is my personal favorite, the, well, what Linda's trying to say is, right? Or what Nicole's trying to say is, okay, so this is your example of, quote, mansplaining. It's also called white-splaining. There's a very funny video if you'd like to learn more about white-splaining, where everybody tells the racial or ethnic diverse person how they're feeling and what they should be feeling, right? So that's an example of the, you know, what she's trying to say is. And another one, is that your natural hair? So I have curly hair, and for some bizarre reason, people feel compelled to touch me as if I am a zoo animal. So people of women of color have spoken a lot about this. Don't touch people in the workplace. Leave everybody's hair alone. That is a microaggression. Or another one, you know, if someone is identified on the LGBTQIA continuum and someone says, oh, you know what? Nancy's gay. I have a gay friend I should introduce you to. Let me introduce you to Tina. Like as if every gay person knows everybody, or person of color, again, in certain communities, you know, I know Chad, Chad's black. Would you like to meet Chad? Okay. Right? These are all examples of workplace microaggressions. And I'm using these examples on purpose and identifying the scholars who have written extensively about these. So again, if you want to learn more, do more, you can certainly look up their work, and they have talked about it in their work within the academy specifically. You'll go to the next, thank you. So occurrences, some of these are pretty obvious, but I'll point out a few more. Again, in an environment where biased behavior or microaggressions are permitted and rampant, these are usually your outcomes, right? You have increased marginalization among the populations who are receiving it. You have a lack of belonging or exclusion. And again, to some of my corporate partners on this call, this is where you have retention issues. So when corporations have invited me in to talk about, well, we hire diverse people, but they never stay. 9 times out of 10, it's the environment. It's not, again, the party is not welcoming. So we start to do things and talk about things in terms of your policies, practices, culture, that may, again, create an environment where someone feels as if they don't belong, they feel excluded, or their diversity of thought is not welcomed. You also start to see diminished academic performance if it's in the classroom. The grades start to slip, or their engagement in what was going on in the classroom starts to slip. You also see, again, a decreased satisfaction with institutional experience. If you're the educator and you're trying to support students, if you're the diverse educator and you're also trying to support diverse students, it's very hard to do that in an environment that you feel is toxic as an employee of that institution, and then translate that support to someone else who's a student in your educational environment. These things are linked. So the diverse members of your team, your faculty or your staff, they can't fake it for other people. If they don't feel that it's a good environment, it's very hard for those folks to support other diverse people in that environment. I think we all, a professional, can probably put on a good poker face, but over time, that will wear thin. Also, the lack of access to resources and opportunity. And this is huge, especially as we start to talk about the professionalization experience in schools. So I think about the student to faculty relationship, especially more so graduate than undergraduate, but those of us who have graduate students, that ability to connect with faculty, that ability to be sponsored or nominated or mentored for research opportunities, fellowship opportunities, all of these things are part of this process of bias. If I don't think XYZ categories of students are worth my time, then I'm not going to invest in them in the ways that I might invest with majority students in a certain way. Can you change the slide, please? Thank you. So again, I'm not going to spend too much time here, but I wanted to highlight specifically the structural assumption associated with some of these workplace microaggressions I highlighted. So the "you speak excellent English" or "your English is so clear" comes from a place of colonialism. And again, if you look at colonial histories, plural, and the use of either French or English as dominant world languages, that's where that comes from. This notion of linguistic superiority, who speaks English in an unaccented voice. So I am very conscious not to say things like this to my international colleagues. We are both speaking English. We're just speaking English in different ways. And because I'm in a US context, the emphasis is on a non-accented form of English. So again, that's the origin of this. So what she's trying to say is, right, there's a combo here of either racial or ethnic superiority coupled with, if it's in a case of sex or gender, patriarchy. And then the "is this your natural hair?" Same thing here, race, ethnicity, and superiority on standards of beauty. The idea that quote unquote straight hair is the professional, in quotations, look, right? And those who occupy or use dreadlocks, cornrows, or other natural hairstyles, you are ethnic and unprofessional, right? This is again based on privilege and standards of norming. Now, for my corporate folks on this call, I always get the pushback, well, there's business attire. I will challenge you to say who gets to set that business attire and based on what cultural assumptions. So yes, workplace culture matters. If you're working at Citibank versus working at Google, there are different styles of dress, but Google has been sued too for some of these things on natural hair as well. So even in relaxed corporate environments, whether or not you determine whose hair is professional or not professional, you need to be careful on that in terms of whether this could be considered biased or discriminatory behavior. Okay, and you should meet my gay friend Linda because you're gay too, right? This idea that everybody wants to be coupled 2 by 2 is patronizing, obviously. It also stems from marginalization, and it has heteronormative, the idea that everybody wants to couple, and the idea that that gay people want to be coupled with your gay friend doesn't necessarily mean that's the case, right? So assuming things, these are some of the structural assumptions. Okay, so I'll wrap up a bit here and talk about how do we break the patterns of this. So we see it, we've claimed it, we see it, it's operating in our workspaces or in our educational environments. How do we disrupt them? The biggest piece, and if I could make a like 45 font, I would. Awareness is the biggest. And if you are not aware of your own either explicit or implicit biases, there's no way in the world you're going to be able to control your behavior. So I'm probably listening to some folks who say, I would never say any of these examples that she just shared. I wonder, because I'm the diversity person who's been doing diversity work for 25 years, and I have been caught in some of these things that I have said that are inappropriate. So we all have biases, we all have them. The key is becoming aware of them. Knowing your triggers is another piece. Are there particular people who trigger you? Do you have particular biases that you are becoming conscious of and it affects the interactions that you have with folks? taking a 10-second pause. If you're in the classroom and there's a certain student who triggers you, take a minute to write down, what is it about that student that triggers me? Is it what he or she is actually saying, or is it the package in which what they're saying is coming in? And so what I mean by that is, and think about it from, faculty meeting perspective, I've sat next to colleagues where I said the exact same thing that the colleague next to me said, but people don't like the colleague next to me, so all of a sudden nobody's listening. Well, they like Nicole, so Nicole's listening, or the reverse. They don't like Nicole and they're not listening. So my point is, see what exactly is triggering you. It might not be what the person's saying. Okay, so I'm going to break it down even more granular. Listening is the key piece here, and teaching yourself. Please, this is a moment where Google is very appropriate. Do not go to the diverse people in your life and ask them what you could be asking Google. Do your own research first, and then come back to the people you know with nuanced questions, okay? So your basic knowledge this is a wonderful place for Wikipedia. As I tell my students, don't put in your papers, but if you're sitting at home and you want to know what's white-splaining, Wikipedia is perfect for that. Okay, you don't need to ask me what's white-splaining. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so I'm going to move super quick. Here are things institutions can do and some things individuals can do. So does your school or workplace have a zero tolerance for cyberbullying, harassment, whatever it may be? A zero tolerance policy is a nice way to go because it, again, articulates what institutional values are and can swiftly address people or actions that don't align with those values. Next slide, please. This is something every institution can do. That doesn't mean you want to necessarily make salaries public. Again, it's those of us at private institutions, that's probably less the case, but you can have key 4 or 5 people in the room to do a wage audit. And this is how you can check for pay equity. So those 4 or 5 people could be your chief financial officer, your chief operating officer, your diversity and inclusion officer, and HR. And those 4 people could do an audit and then publish the aggregate results. Aggregate results meaning either your means or your medians. Medians are better because that's the middle number. Means could be swayed by the very high and the very low, but at least you'd have a sense of that. You can create a community of practice in your organization. These can be formal or informal, but very simply put, these are communities and spaces and places where people want to gather to talk about some of the things that are going on in their organization. This also can be a really nice space to learn more, do more, and lean into certain topics. It doesn't mean that whoever's forming your community of practice is all of a sudden a diversity expert. No, but it means that it's a place for you to have more nuanced conversations where it might not be appropriate to do that in a staff meeting, or it might not be appropriate to do that in another context. But this is your space and place for everybody to contribute to everyone's knowledge set. And they could have, again, very defined purposes, meaning we want to talk about whether or not we have an inclusion problem at our school or community. We want to talk about how can we serve the needs of diverse populations in our organization or school community. They can have a set purpose, but the structure of them can be loose and the agenda associated with them can be loose. Next slide, please. Ooh, that came out really tiny. I didn't mean it to. So just a quick aside here, a community practice is not like another committee. Again, as I mentioned, it's voluntary typically. People can select in and select out. It's also typically informal. Now, it can be formalized, meaning the company says we would like to institute a community of practice for this specific goal. That can be formalized, but who comes and goes should not be mandated, because the spirit of it is for one to, again, be there voluntarily and to contribute to their sets of knowledge. So here are some of the pros and benefits if you decide to set up a community of practice. Again, it can be a support place, back to what we talked about before and the experiences of one who experiences marginalization in the workplace. It could also be a space for accelerating professional development across the organization, identifying some patterns that you might see or that might be brought to the attention of the community of practice before they become problems. So if you look and say, you know, so-and-so was passed over for a promotion several times, the community of practice might be the space that identifies that before he or she takes it to HR or it becomes an issue. So sometimes community of practices can be a nice place to sort of head off things before they become larger. They also can be spaces that you can break down organizational silos, because anybody in the organization can join it. It's not it's not tied to someone's position or their division within the organization. And it also puts DEI topics, or can put DEI topics, on the agenda regularly. So again, I said before, I do trainings with my administrative and faculty constituents at my university, and I tell them, don't wait till I come back next year to do DEI training to talk about DEI. You can talk about it all year long if you have a community of practice within your unit. It also, again, letting the community evolve. What you started out with may not be what you end up with in terms of how the community evolves. Be open to that process of it taking a more organic flow. When can we do it? You can fit it in. I always say do it when you're doing other things, things that are already part of your routine. So if you have a monthly staff meeting or you have a weekly staff meeting, dedicate one meeting a month to your community of practice. Build it in. Here are some topics. Feel free to go. These are the only topics, but I said, here, if you don't know what to talk about, here's some things you can talk about. You could talk about your DEI strategic goals for your school or your organization. You could talk about looking for diverse students or workers in non-usual places. You could talk about, if it's an academic setting, are there certain gateway courses or courses that certain populations find difficult? Overall student success, how do our diverse populations measure up to our majority populations, question mark. Everybody these days is doing a climate survey. Oh, go back, I'm sorry. You can do the climate survey and look at specific populations, all of the above. Okay, now we can go, thank you. Here's what individuals can do. Get to know people of color and really get to know them. Not on that surface level where it's like, oh, down the street, there's a, Ecuadorian lady I see every time I walk my dog. No, that's not getting to know somebody. Getting to know somebody is getting to know somebody as a human. So the more people in your circle who are diverse, your diverse toolkit will get bigger. So I challenge everyone on here, get to know people of color and really get to know them. Walk up to a colleague that you are curious about, or you would like to spend some time. You could say stuff like, hey, we've been working together for 5 years and we serve on this committee together. We've never gone to lunch. Would you like to go to lunch? Simple. Okay. Go ahead. You can change the slide, please. If there isn't a diversity committee in your organization, start one. That could be your community of practice on an informal level, and then bring it to your management team or your supervisor or whomever and say, we would like to do this more regularly. Can we get some support in some way? But this is a good way, again, for you to start to talk about these things and build your empathy interest level. And this goes back to challenging our own biases and stereotypes, right? I love that Eric shared his personal narrative as well. We should do more of that in general. But ask yourself some critical questions. Are there some, stereotypes that you've heard or believe, even if you don't think you believe them? I love the pictures that image is holding up. Do I criminalize every Black person I see, especially Black men? Do I have an image in my head of who's a leader? And is that image usually male? Do I have attitudes about age in my mind in terms of who are workers from different age cohorts? All of these things are ways you can challenge your own biases and stereotypes. And this one's a microaggression. I put some things up there, but again, this is where if you see it, speak up, and speak up often and early. I always say to folks who come up to me after, wow, what Michael said to you was terrible, and they tell you that in the hallway. Well, if it was so terrible, how come you didn't say anything in the meeting? Support people in the moment. And if that's not your style, you can always go up to Michael after and say, you know what, Michael, one-on-one, what you said to Linda or Nicole was not really appropriate. And here's why it was uncomfortable for me. But this is the way to break these things down. If you don't like them, we have to change them. So those are a few ways to do that. Thank you, everyone. I went quickly, but I'm hoping you got something from that. So I'll turn things back over to Eric.
Thank you, Nicole. And thanks for those who have done a little bit of chatting while I've gone. We'd love it, really love it, if you have questions or comments that are occurring to you, or just things you'd like to see us address. We have about 20 minutes remaining here. I'm going to cover a few additional activation tools here briefly, but we hope we have some time for dialogue here as we near the end. Nicole, I also just wanted to recognize the metaphor of the 100 paper cuts and the welcoming party. Both helped me advance my own thinking, so thanks. Metaphors are often so powerful. I found both of those really solidifying for me. So The toolkit that I mentioned, and as I shared, it's broken down into lessons. These are links to some lessons. And so if you're an educator in classroom who's struggling with how do I do global or civic learning now that we're all remote, these are all built as flipped classrooms, just like the page we linked to earlier. So there's a flipped classroom page on what does global citizenship have to do with local actions and community building. That one's built from Philadelphia, so it features Philadelphia-based organizations and thinking about our region's inclusion. What is sustainability and what does it do? In what ways does it interconnect with global solidarity and local actions? There we link into sustainable development goals and starting to think about how we take ideals that are often kind of bandied about in US culture and get more systematic about moving forward on them and linking them to global thinking. That also relates to this other page on what is the status of justice, inclusion, and sustainability in Philadelphia. To take just a little example there, we speak about what we know locally in the context of global goals. So the Pew Charitable Trust, which is based in Philadelphia, recently in some of its Trends on Philadelphia reporting noted that the population of incarcerated individuals in Philadelphia is declining, which they shared as good news. And it certainly is good news in its objective self. We're also still horrifically disproportionate in how we incarcerate compared to the rest of the world. So it's important to always be able to take steps back to understand local. Similarly, on sustainability issues in Philadelphia, we're just sort of okay by US city standards, and in global context, horrifically, right? The United States compared to US cities compared to other similarly wealthy cities around the world tends not to do particularly well. So those are all about stepping into that as discrete lessons, flipped classroom kind of ways. All these are built with a college level reader in mind. So I think they're college relevant. And I certainly have seen some great high school level educators bringing students up to that level. I would think it'd be relevant there too. Like I said at the outset, we're interested in civics as something that's accessible for everyone. Also, cultural humility as a concept that really advances people's effort to think systematically about their own identity as it relates to positionality and systems change. That's the concept of cultural humility. So walking people into that concept as well as how it relates to power, two discrete lessons there. And then finally on civic action, giving examples of civil society, again with videos and just things that I hope, I know, in fact, from teaching that young people and people of all ages can get excited about in terms of stories of change and how that happens and how our own individual strengths relate to different kinds of change, whether it's project-based or activism or, artistic visionary futurism. So those are all different tools that are packaged up for classrooms for use this fall. I believe this next page links to some resources that Nicole and her team have put together on understanding the current situation, understanding white privilege and its effects, and celebrating and supporting Juneteenth. There are a lot of great resources underneath each of those arrows, just a kind of evergreen reading resources. Nicole, do you want to add anything to that?
No, well said. We update it periodically and try to address by topic. So again, folks can, I'll echo what Eric said earlier, that our things are on the website to be used. So please use them and avail yourself of the resources that are there.
Okay. Well, we're at the end of the hour here and we have a bit of time. I'm going to stop screen sharing so that we can see one another more easily. In a moment, actually, I also want to say a couple of things about the links here and where we're headed. And finally, I just encourage people to drop anything into chat once more. Regarding the toolkit that we shared, just want to emphasize, I saw a lot of people coming in from Davis and other parts of the country. If you look at these resources, most of the resources do not have a specific Philadelphia base, but several do. And if you look at the resources and say, hey, we'd love to make something, a section like this that relates to Davis or to California, you'll see on there some colleagues in France and Italy wrote from their contexts, right? So it's definitely welcome to be part of public scholarship that just grows here. And we hope to see that. And we've really developed it in a way that we work hard to make sure that anyone writing toward the site gets very clear credit so that people can really acknowledge their contributions as well. Also, we're having additional sessions moving forward. On Thursday, there's a session with Dickinson College about how they've used these pages to facilitate an international conversation among their community-based faculty around the world, talking with students about these concepts from their different locations. They accredited that and did that course this past summer. That's on Thursday. It's on the same website. They're underneath the collaborative where we shared this originally. But the collaborative, FEND, and PACEY will continue sharing these opportunities. There are much more coming up, not just about the toolkit, but other sessions in October. We're going to do one on the state of international education, et cetera, et cetera. And finally, we're all the institutions and the individuals on Twitter and really interested in keeping up the conversations. Nicole is really more of a LinkedIn person, right? But like dynamic there, right? So I included that as well. But we do hope, I think it's true to say, of the collaborative FEND of PACEY, we're interested in supporting communities of practice around these vital issues, and that happens online, offline, and continuously. So thanks to everyone. I'm going to stop screen share, and I see Catherine has a comment, question. Nicole?
Sure. So there's a question in the chat regarding expanding resources to the Latino or Latinx communities. And I would say we in Philadelphia are very spoiled that we have a number of resources that are specific to different populations. So the Latino Chamber, National Chamber of Commerce has been partnering with some of the City of Philadelphia organizations to do programming that's specific to that population. And we are in contact with each other through a number of organizations. I put the PHL diversity website in the chat as well. So I know we did focus a lot on this conversation in kind of the black-white narrative, but I agree that, you know, we also have other, and our Asian populations, especially with the rise of COVID-19 and anti-Asian xenophobia that has been happening over the result of the pandemic. So agreed. And there are a number of resources. The Asian Chamber of Commerce as well has done a lot of work this summer, specifically around stigma and Asian directed xenophobia. So.
Thanks, Nicole. And actually the first page I mentioned when I went through the additional resources, talking about local activation of global citizenship in Philadelphia, it links to Puentes de Salud, which is a public health organization in Philadelphia, as well as activist artistic efforts by a woman called Michelle Angel Ortiz, who does just extraordinary, I'm not going to go into it here because I get too excited and take the last 10 minutes, but just extraordinary artistic activism in Philadelphia, Harrisburg, and well beyond. So we have some of that. We'd love to see more of it. And if you have specific ideas or questions, please keep them coming.
And I would add to Talia Puertorriqueño here in Philly. They do, it's a community-based organization. I'll put the link in the chat, but they do a lot of speaker events and just amazing. It's around the arts, but they talk about many other experiences here in Philly. So. Are there other questions?
I see Molly just entered a question about if, how have you or would you envision schools or universities connecting these tools with community partners? Maybe partially answer this, but if you all could elaborate a little bit about how you could see that happening.
Yeah, well, and Molly, I'll share as we developed this, part of the honest reason we developed this when we did, as we did, was we found ourselves comparatively well-resourced and uncertain about how we were going to spend our time. And we're aware that generally speaking, and I realize this is a very reckless, could become very reckless, but I'm going to say that generally speaking, most NGOs, most nonprofits want to share their mission more with more people. And if we are in good relationship and can share that well, we have something of an assumption that they'd like us to share and extend their messages. Which is somewhat of where we started, though we started in deep relationships. So Puentes is a great example of, they've seen the site, they like the site. Michelle, we had on campus last year, et cetera. And Puentes actually started to reflect on, now we're going to be training volunteers in a new way in the fall, and we want to do a training with them that involves thinking about structural racism in the context of immigration. How can we get those materials together? And we're talking with them about, can we do this collaboratively? So that collaborative possibility there is very much the spirit or vision of the kind of thing we'd love to keep moving forward.
And I'll just point another question from Mary Grace on ideas about getting teenagers to think about their biases and teaching about the harm of microaggressions.
Yeah, so I just dropped something in the chat. Sorry, I didn't know you were going with that question next. And it's not quite directed at the teens per se, but it is first-year students. And I like that UCLA has been very intentional about focusing their first-year experience on microaggressions and they're not too far removed from the high school crowd. And they have a lot of resources on their website geared towards kind of where they are developmentally to engage in conversations around eradicating microaggressions and its use. And some of the materials focus on some of the things that I've pointed out today in terms of the structural causes, so folks would understand where those microaggressions are and why they can be harmful to certain populations. So for example, I'll share one. Folks have said to me, wow, you're just so articulate. And again, I go back and I say, well, I have a PhD. People who have PhDs usually are articulate. But why that's problematic to say that to a person of color is it assumes, right, that that person, A, is speaking English in a way that is the quote unquote preferred way to speak it. And then also there are some social class biases embedded in that as well. So unpacking some of that is what I think UCLA's resources do really well.
My good colleague, Stephanie Keene, who, like I mentioned earlier, responsible for so many of the pages here, also just gave us a shout out to say, follow the CPDC on Twitter, folks. Stephanie, maybe you could drop the handle in to everybody. It's Haverford_CPDC. That's Center for Peace and Global Citizenship at Haverford. And we will continue to share events like this. And actually, yesterday, a colleague with FEND said, hey, we'd love to do one with a number of regional institutions on sustainability and how it intersects with these interdependence issues. Yes, we're here because we want to be a collaborative group. So if ideas come forward, we'd love to support that. This is my own, Mary Grace asked the question about teenagers a moment ago, and I think that's why I shared as I did about my own story. I sure don't have the answer, but I spend a lot of time wondering about rural white males and rural suburban males, and how and whether it's possible to model for them getting off of a kind of very defensive individualistic cultural assumption, and opening oneself to the possibility that there are inequities, and we white male cisgender males are disproportionately likely to receive privileges as a result of those inequities. It's such a obviously constellation of things involved in trying to get people to open to that possibility and then supporting them with growth over time. Yeah. I'm sorry, I don't know whether to say Anja or Anja, but tips on working with groups in growing pains. Nicole, do you have any thing you'd like there?
So I was reading it and I was trying to understand the privileged and not privileged groups. So if I understand the question correctly, and please correct me if I'm wrong, it's kind of how to, when I spend time on privilege personally in doing these trainings, I do spend time on talking about the difference between structural privilege and individual privilege. And I'll just give a very quick example. So, for example, someone growing up in the suburbs where there's an excellent school district and they don't have to think about issues of their own personal safety, that is something that is an individualized experience of privilege. But the fact that one could have systems of education where there are radically different systems determined by zip code, that is structural. So in other words, a person of color who grows up in the suburbs and has excellent access to education doesn't mean that person's not experiencing any personal difficulties, but it means that that person does not have to then also overcome structural issues in order to obtain a good education. It's taken for granted that that's going to happen to you because of where you live. And so my point in highlighting that difference, and again, I'm doing it in 5 minutes here where I spend more time doing that in a prepared, training, but I do that on purpose because there's this kind of gut response among those who say, I didn't get anything handed to me. I worked really hard in my life. I don't have privilege. Well, that's might be true for you at an individual level, but it is not true for you on a structural level. And so unpacking that is important. So that helps to sort of reduce some of the I'm not privileged or that sense of quote unquote guilt or anger responses to someone being accused of having privilege. I hope I answered the question.
I think we want to be honest about time here, and we're at the end of the time that we said we'd have together. That's such a great question, and if we can, we'll try to gather up a couple of more resources or point to them as we send our note out to you all in the coming week. Thanks for spending time with us, and please do stay in relationship. We know if you spent an hour and 15 minutes to think on this afternoon that we want to be in your camp and vice versa. So have a great afternoon. Thank you, Nicole, Nora, Julie.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.